All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure there'll be more people joining us slowly as we get going. Hey, again, thank you all for taking the time out of your Sunday mornings to come here over this next 4 weeks. What we're looking to do is, it's my boss. Would you like a notebook?
No, I've already seen it.
Oh, you've already seen it? Okay. What we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks is walking through selected minor prophets books. Remember, there are 12 of them. And very so often, people will hurry over the minor prophets, moving their way from Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah. They've got the story through the historical books. They've got a little bit of prophecy, and they want to rush towards the Gospels and getting into the Jesus stuff. But there's lots of great content within the books of the 12, these 12 minor prophets. We didn't have an extensive time to go over all of them, so I specifically chose Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Haggai as sort of illustrate this broad idea of God's judgment in the Old Testament and his graciousness towards his people. For those of you watching online, sorry I couldn't be here with us today, but these are going to be recorded. The notebook that everybody has is going to be available online as a PDF. You can download that for free and follow along as you go. We're starting off in the prophet of Nahum, which contains God's judgment in Nineveh. The structure of the book, if you look in your workbook, on the very first page, right, it's going to talk a little bit about the writer, who was Nahum. His name means comforter, and he's identified in the very first chapter, in the very first verse of the book. It's hit or miss in the minor prophets whether the individual is named, but in this book, he is. He is from the city of Elkosh, which is a few miles north of Assyria, which was the powerhouse during the time, and Nineveh was one of the big capital cities of Assyria, specifically who Nahum is prophesying against. You might remember Nineveh as the city that Jonah prophesied against, right? Well, let's put a timeline together. Jonah prophesied against Nineveh about 100 years before. So it was Jonah who prophesied 100 years, and 100 years later, Nahum prophesied, and then 100 years later, in 612, Nineveh was destroyed by the Babylonians. So we'll get into some details about, why exactly God allowed 200 years of that, but the message of the book is that Nahum will sound this death keel on Nineveh and pronounces judgment from the total destruction of Assyria, and in God doing this. Remember, Jonah prophesied against the wickedness of Nineveh 100 years before Nahum, and Jonah is our lackluster minor prophet. He came forward, gave this very almost 2 or 3 sentence prophecy against their evilness, and Nineveh repented. Well, that repentance really only lasted 1 generation. The next generation grew up, more wickedness came before God, and God saw it fit to bring judgment upon Nineveh now. So the writer introduces this book as an oracle against Nineveh and the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. Remember, Nineveh was actually founded by Nimrod in Genesis 10, 8 through 12. And it was located along the banks, the east bank of the Tigris River. I already mentioned Elkosh was a city in northern Assyria. That's going to be important, the geographical location of Nineveh on the Tigris River, as you have to understand before we jump into Nahum, you have to understand the sheer magnitude of how large Nineveh was. It wasn't this small city like Lowell, Arkansas. It was grand in stature. In the book of Jonah, in chapter 3:3, we get kind of a clue as to how big Nineveh is. Remember, it says that Nineveh was an enormous city, required 3 days to walk through. Our lackluster prophet Jonah only walked 1 day and said, "Hey guys, repent," and then left. And they repented, right? The king of Nineveh put on sackcloth and ashes, sat in ashes, and repented. So let's extrapolate some ideas here. If you can walk for 8 hours a day at a 2 to 3 mile pace, you're probably picking up about 20 miles per day, right? Give or take. 3-day journey would be about 60 miles. So the circumference of Nineveh was 60 miles from the east to the west, north to south. For some perspective, that is the distance from Bentonville, Arkansas, as the crow flies, to Fort Smith. This was a massive city. And you can understand that, and it makes sense when we talk later about the river Kerz was a river that flowed through the city of Nineveh, which the Ninevites actually used as part of their irrigation system. And when you think about Bentonville to Fort Smith, how many rivers run through that area? It is a large metroplex. The entirety of DFW, from White Settlement in the west to about Forney in the east, is about the same size. So imagine, someone calls the complete destruction of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That's quite the claim that will happen. So now that you have some broad perspective on the size of Nineveh, the scope of the book becomes enormous, right? And we're going to walk through. I just want to quickly give you an idea of how the book is structured. It's kind of structured in, let me pull up my notes here, 3 parts. Right? Well, 2 major parts, but the heading, the intro, gets its own little special section. But primarily, in chapter 1, and you have on page 4 of your notebook, you have an outline of the book. This is taken from my influence and also the influence of some of my seminary professors. The heading is its own little section. 1:1 introduces us to the book, introduces us to the context and the message of the book. Section 2, which is the entirety of verse 1, is going to establish God's character as judge. And it's going to do so in a couple different ways, that God is good, but also he is a God of anger. And we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean. It'll also, in verses 9 through 14, it's going to take that God as judge, as Nahum has established in those 2 specific ways, and it's going to apply them to both Nineveh and Judah. Right? Nahum's going to say, now that I've established God as this certain type of judge, I'm now going to apply that judge and dish out my, my verdict, both on Nineveh and my verdict both on Judah. He's going to juxtapose their 2 positions and really see how the script is going to be flipped. The third section, the final section of Nahum, from chapter 2 to the end of chapter 3, is going to talk about, it's going to give these 4 detailed illustration of Nineveh's destruction in very distinct ways. And there is some brutalness to that. So, now you have an idea of the structure, let's dive right into the content. The very opening verse of Nahum form a prologue dominated by the revelation of God's eternal power in his divine nature and creation. As in Romans 18 through 32, this revelation is characterized preeminently by God's justice expressed in the retribution and wrath that shake the entire creation. So, Nahum will begin by establishing Yahweh as perfect judge, a judge that is both just and powerful. I'll start us off here. I think this is verse 2. The Lord is zealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and very angry. The Lord takes vengeance against his foes. He sustains his rage against his enemies, but the Lord is slow to anger. Well, that kind of sounds a lot like the God of the Old Testament when you really think about it. You can see right in those 3 verses, there's this idea in the Hebrew called nokem. That's the Hebrew word for avenging and vengeance. There have been entire movies and series franchises based off this idea of avenging. I mean, my wife and I can't even watch the John Wick movies because of the first scene where he kills a puppy. But it's that idea of getting vengeance, right? That's not what we're talking about here. That's not the character of God that Nahum is describing. Yes, God is avenging, but more in the legalistic sense. That idea, nokem, and maintaining justice, to carry out justice, is, in legalistic terms, it's proper. You're carrying out justice within the proper context, right? So it's not, I'm going to get vengeance against something you've done against me. Certainly Nineveh has done enough that their evilness is brought before the Lord, so God will now carry out justice in a legal setting. In Western Semitic languages, that word nokem is most likely used in legal settings. So that's what Nahum is suggesting. His zeal, his anger, his wrath are directed towards those who violate his righteousness, which in many cases are going to be God's enemies. Now, there are certain instances where God's people violate his righteousness, right? Specifically in Exodus, and God looks to seek out his anger, his vengeance, his zeal against them. There are many examples of that in the Old Testament where God sends his people into exile as punishment, because God can only sustain that happen or unrighteousness against his face for so long. But additionally, God is slow to anger. That's an interesting part there in verse 3a. He's slow to anger. Jonah prophesied against the wickedness of Nineveh. God did not destroy them because they repented. But then 100 years later, it kept building and kept building. And so now that it's overtly in the face of God, God must act. He must act to destroy the wickedness. Think about how in the Noah story, right? God allowed the wickedness to suffice for so long before he decided to destroy them. Right? So Yahweh is powerful. And this idea of a judge has to be both just and powerful. They have to have the right indignation, to a righteous nature, to deal out justice in a way that is sufficient, but they also have to be powerful. So Yahweh is just. He is jealous and avenging. He is vengeful and wrathful. But he is also slow to anger, right? A good judge does not quickly deal out harsh sentence to somebody who's only violated them a little bit, right? But Yahweh is also powerful. And when we talk about Yahweh's powerful nature, Nahum chooses to describe Yahweh's powerful nature in the terms of how he relates to creation, right? So in verse 4, he says, he shouts a battle cry, or let's start over. In verse 3, continuing, but great in power, the Lord will certainly not allow the wicked to go unpunished, and he doesn't. He marches out like whirlwinds and the raging storm. Dark clouds billow like dust under his feet. He shouts a battle cry against the sea and makes it dry up. That's a reference to Exodus 14:21, where God dried up the Red Sea. He also makes the rivers run dry. That's a reference to Joshua 3:16. Bashan and Carmel wither, the blossoms of Lebanon wither, and the mountains tremble before him, the hills convulse, the earth is laid waste before him. The world and all its inhabitants are laid to waste. No one can withstand his indignation, and no one can resist his fierce anger. His wrath is poured out like volcanic fire. Boulders are broken up as he approaches. The Lord is good. Indeed, he is a fortress in times of distress. I'm going to pause there. So Nahum now has to illustrate Yahweh as powerful. Remember, a judge has to be powerful in order to be able to carry out the sentence that they dish out. So he uses this imagery: clouds like dust, seas, rivers dry up, mountains, earth tremble, wrath pours out like fire, rocks shatter. And really, he's taking the four chaotic elements in Jewish traditions which the typical Jews feared, the primarily one being water, and we'll talk about that, and showing that God has power and control over these uncontrollable elements. So what do you think he's going to do to you, Assyria? Remember, for those of you who own a home, you'll know that water is the number one enemy of your house. Water is the most destructive element in the entire world, right? So God is saying in these verses where Nahum is illustrating God's power, he's saying, look, God is power from the water above, meaning the clouds, the raging storms. He is God of the water on earth. He's using the Red Sea, right, and the sea and the Jordan River. But God is also in control of the waters below. He uses the illustration of Bashan, Carmel, and the blossoms of Lebanon. Bashan and Carmel were the most prosperous and fertile areas which were extremely resistant to any kind of drought. They could weather the storms of a drought. Because the water around that surrounding area was so saturated with water, they could do so. So God is saying, look, I have control over the most chaotic element in the world, both above, on, and below the earth. God has this powerful. He is powerful enough to carry out the sentence that he is about to dish out to both Nineveh and Judah. So Nahum establishes Yahweh as perfect judge, right? He has the right indignation and the righteousness to dish out sentencing. And also, God has the power to do so. And his focus is now centered upon Nineveh. So now what Nahum has done, he's taken the character of God that he's established in this first section, and now he's going to apply that situation to both Nineveh and Judah, right? He starts off, we are in verse 9, that whatever you plot against the Lord, he will completely destroy. Distress will not arise a second time. Surely they will be totally consumed, like the entangled thorn bushes, like the drink of drunkards, like the very dry stubble. From you, O Nineveh, one has marched forward who plots evil against the Lord. a wicked military strategist. So in this section, Yahweh is speaking directly to Assyria and Judah, taking both of them and promising destruction to Assyria, focused on Nineveh, and deliverance to Judah. So he's going to do so in the typical ways that Hebrew writers illustrate things. He's going to give a general description of Nineveh's destruction and then a specific description of Nineveh's destruction. He's going to give a general description of Judah's salvation and then a general description of Judah's salvation. In verses 9 through 11, he continues that theme of fire, talking about, thorn bushes that will be consumed totally like the drink of the drunkard. Thorn bushes are great for poking and pricking, but they don't do a lot of damage. But when compared to fire, when exposed to the elements, they are easily consumed. Drunkards from their wine, those who suffer with alcoholism, are easily consumed by alcohol, and it completely destroys them. And being consumed like dry stubble, continuing in that theme of God as fire, is in control of one of those chaotic elements that rule the world. Now, this is all because of Nineveh's wicked plans against God. Sennacherib III had already besieged Jerusalem once in 1 Kings 18, and he was planning a second attempt, but God stepped in, and he knew that would never happen. The liberation of Judah. So what does the Lord say about Judah? In verse 12, he says, "This is what the Lord says to Judah. Even though they are powerful," let me see here, general description, what will happen? Let's back up. Yes. So the liberation of Judah. Even though they are powerful, the Assyrian Empire, and what is more, even though their army is numerous, nevertheless, they will be destroyed and trickled away. Although I have afflicted you, I will not afflict you no more. And now I will break Assyria's yoke bar from your neck, and I will tear apart the shackles that are on you. So take a look at what the Lord says about the liberation of Judah. He is going to completely flip what Judah has experienced under the oppression of Assyria back to what they, back to what they experienced before Assyria. He says, even though they are numerous, they will be destroyed. Even though they have afflicted you, God will act to make sure that they don't afflict you anymore. Even though you have been burdened by their yoke, God will remove it. Even though you are shackled, God will tear the shackles off. Right? So he's going to completely flip the experiences of the Judeans from what they have experienced under Assyria. And let's go to the next slide. Now, what is Yahweh's plans for both Nineveh and Judah, specifically looking at what God will do? God has already promised to destroy Nineveh and to restore Judah, but in what ways will he do that? Well, the Lord decreed and has issued a decree against you. Your dynasty will come to an end. I will destroy the idols and images in the temples of your God. I will desecrate your grave because you are accursed. Now he talks about the specifics of Judah. Look, a herald is running on the mountains. A messenger is proclaiming deliverance. Celebrate your sacred festivals, O Judah. Fulfill your sacred vows to praise God. For never again will the wicked Assyrians invade you, for they have been completely destroyed. So Yahweh, before we get into the descriptions of the four destructions, Yahweh promises in verse 14 that Nineveh will not have descendants, they will not have images, they will not have idols, they will not have temples, or they will not have gods. Instead, what they will have are graves. Juxtaposed with Judah's restoration, Judah will now have good news, they will have peace, they will have festivals, they will have vows, but what they will not have is continued persecution. And this is an interesting thing to point out. What Nineveh will have taken away is all monetary. Their gold, later on their silver, their idols, their images. These are all symbols that go against God. This is specifically what God was aiming to destroy. And their retribution or their reward for that will be graves. On the other hand, what Judah will have is exactly, or is in line with who God is. They will have peace, they will have festivals, which celebrates the good work of the Lord They will have vows to the God, they will have peace, but they will not have persecution. So God is going to completely flip the experiences and the states of both Nineveh and Judah. And it's absolutely beautiful. Hang on. Now we get into the descriptions of the destructions of Nineveh. And if it felt like I hurried through there, I apologize, but this is really where we get into the bulk of the book. Now, in these chapters, if you're looking for some sort of deep theological meaning or messaging, you are going to be sorely disappointed. The message in these next 2 chapters is clear. As the Lord of hosts, I am against you. Now, there are many who think that Nahum prophesied after the destruction of Nineveh, because of which the accuracy and the detail that he described the destruction. What he said come to pass is exactly what happened when the Babylonians sieged Nineveh and completely destroyed it in 612. So much so that there's very little archaeological evidence left that the city of Nineveh even existed. So as we begin, we see that God will give a mocking call to Nineveh as prepare for his advances, as if any city or anything could prep against the massive destruction and power of Yahweh. And he will give an approving call to Judah to rejoice in the fact that Nineveh is going to be destroyed. So the Lord is sovereign and just to see that the transition that he just described, taking Nineveh to destruction, taking Judah to restoration, will happen. Let's jump into the 4 descriptions. And these are where we really get into some good stuff. Remember, it's not just the destruction of Nineveh here, but also the restoration of Judah through the destruction of Nineveh that God is going to accomplish. We're going to start off in chapter 2, verse 3. The first description. The shields of the soldiers are red. The warriors are clad in scarlet. The metal on the chariots flashes on the day they are made ready. The spears of juniper are brandished. The chariots storm through the streets, rushing back and forth through the square. They look like flaming torches. They dart about like lightning. Nineveh summons her picked troops, yet they stumble on their way. They dash to the city walls, and the protective shield is put in place. But the river gates are thrown open, and the palace collapses. It is decreed that Nineveh will be exiled and carried away. Her female slaves moan like doves and beat on their breasts. So in this section, in these 4 verses, there's going to be a description of the first attack, which is going to be used heavily in military imagery. But then verse 5 to 7 is going to be, what is Nineveh's response to this? And it paints this picture of, in the first, verse 3 to 4, it paints this picture of this army is prepared. They are well-trained, they are organized, and they are ferocious. When you look at their soldiers, the shields of their soldiers are red, the warriors are clad in scarlet. Many people think that is a description of, we're killing so many people, the blood is splashing on us that it's turning our equipment red. Not necessarily. This is describing the preparedness of the army, the professionalism of the army. I mean, look at the United States Army today. They are prepped. They have the equipment. They have the readiness. And not that they were soaked in blood, as I have written here, but this is a reference to both the Medes and the Babylonians who were associated with the color red. Ezekiel 23:14 gives us that snippet. Their shields were either leather that was dyed red or made of bronze and copper to look red. Either way, the description of the color is meant to signify that the attackers look powerful and invincible. This is a true army, right? Nineveh's response is a bit lackluster in verses 5 through 7. Although Nineveh does summon her troops, they stumble, right? Although they do run to the city walls and get ready in this clumsily fashion, it doesn't matter. The river gates are thrown open, everything collapses, and Nineveh is carried away into exile. So we've walked through Nineveh's army is mighty, right? This imagery, they have red shields, scarlet armor, metal chariots, juniper spears, organized troops. But Yahweh is mightier than the preparations of the Ninevites, and the gates are thrown open, they're exiled, and they are carried away. Let's back up for a second and continue on this first description. I want to walk. So when it says, right here, the river gates are thrown open. First, let me back up and talk about something. Where was my notes here? This army that God is describing is not necessarily attributed to any sort of nation. We have clues in there, and we know from Progress Revelation and history that it will be the Babylonians, but Nahum, unlike Habakkuk in the next book, does not specifically attribute this powerful army to any nation. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first one is that Nahum wants all credit for the destruction of Nineveh to go to God, who prepared and used this army, so he keeps them nameless. And two, what was my second one? One of the problems with Habakkuk, when Habakkuk specifically mentions that God will rise with the Babylonian army, is this question of how can God use a wicked force to bring about his just and holy purpose on earth? There is none of that here. The specifics are everything that is happening with this army. God raised up this army. There is no attribution, there is no power, there is no glory given to any other nation rather than God, who's using this unnamed army. That's a little bit about that. Verse 6 talks about the river gates are thrown open. I mentioned earlier, Nineveh was this large metroplex which had rivers running through it. And Sennacherib, who ran the city, he had created a series of canals and sluice channels that provided water to the different parts of Nineveh as part of their irrigation system. And the river the river Kurs, was used as a defensive mechanism. It was used as part of the fortification, along with the Tigris River, which Nineveh sat on, and it was seen as very impenetrable because of that natural fortification. But what's funny here is that the armies, because they invade, are going to use that natural fortification as part of the destruction of Nineveh. And it's amazing because that's exactly what the Babylonians did in 612 BC when they sieged the city. I mean, Nahum so vividly describes this army attack on Nineveh that he wanted to ensure the people that God had the power to do this, and it would happen just as described. Nahum had confidence that this would happen. So there's this wonderful commercial, maybe back in the 90s, where I'm sure some of you have seen it, all of you have seen it, where Larry Bird is standing on the court shooting baskets, and Michael Jordan comes up with some McDonald's, right? And Larry's like, I'll play you for it. And they begin to engage in this ridiculous series of horse to see who will win the McDonald's Big Mac. In the 90s, that's funny. And what happens is it starts out normally. Larry Bird's like, 3, swish. He makes it. Michael Jordan makes it. And then Michael Jordan's like, okay, half court off the bank board. And he makes it perfectly. And then it shows them up in the bleachers, and Larry's like, off the scoreboard, off the ground, off the backboard, swish. And it happens perfectly. And then it shows them up in the rafters, and Michael Jordan's like, off the second rafter, off the scoreboard, off the ground, off the backboard, nothing but net. And he swishes it perfectly. And then it gets even more and more ridiculous to the point they're standing on this huge building, and Larry Bird's like, over the river, off the interstate, through the window, off the wall, off the scoreboard, off the ground, off the backboard, nothing but net. And he has so much confidence that he's going to make that basketball shot that he provides this ridiculous description of what exactly is going to happen, and he has the confidence to ensure that it will happen. Exactly what's happening with Nineveh and Nahum's description here. Nahum is so confident that the Lord will destroy Nineveh that he is in this very specific way. Let's pick up with the second description of Nineveh's fall. This one is less focused on the power and might and the overwhelming military force of the attackers. Rather, it focuses on the cultural influence and what will be taken away from Nineveh. That is not it. He says to them in verse 8, Nineveh is like a pool whose water is draining away. Stop, stop, they cry, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. The supply is endless. The wealth from all its treasures. She is pillaged, plundered, and stripped. Hearts melt, knees give way, bodies tremble, every face grows pale. So Nahum, he'll continue this imagery of water. Remember, he's already established that God is in control of this uncontrollable element, water. And God will not only use this mighty army that he's brought up, but he will use the water, their own fortifications against them. And not even their wealth or their cultural influence will be stopped. See, Nineveh's wealth will be taken away. Nineveh had large cultural influences over the entire surrounding areas. They gained their wealth primarily through two ways. The first will be military conquest. You go out, you destroy civilization, you take all they have and bring it back. The second way was through vassal states. They acquired many city-states who were fearful of Nineveh's military destructive power, and so they would often exploit those states to gain gold, riches, and everything. But the point of this section is that Nineveh is powerless against the Lord. Even though they have this cultural significance, this mighty presence, Nahum says, now where is the lion's den, the place where they feed their youngs? Where is the lion and lioness went, and the cubs, with nothing to fear? The lion's killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mates, finding his lairs with the kill, and his dens with the prey. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on earth. The voice of your messengers will no longer be heard. So not only will Nineveh's wealth be taken away, in some instant, or really in this second half of the second description of Nineveh's fall, Nahum is essentially mocking the Assyrians for what they once were, but for the fact that they will no longer be after Yahweh destroys it. For a long time, the Assyrians had referred to themselves as lions. The ferocity of which a lion takes over his prey was the way in which the Assyrian army described themselves. But Nahum is mocking them here. They are no longer the lions. After Nineveh is destroyed, which will happen, they will no longer have the military might to even be compared to a lion, because he will leave no prey on earth, and the voices of your messengers, the messengers of Nineveh, will no longer be heard. So not only is God going to strip away the wealth of the city, their gold and silver, which was bought through blood, he is also going to strip away their military might and mock them for it. And in the last section there of verse 13, and the voice of their messengers will no longer be heard, meaning that the influence of Assyria will no longer be there. They will be looked at in history as a laughingstock, because, verse 13 reflects upon the second description of Nineveh's fall, using all these images to say God is going to completely destroy you in the same way that Nineveh and the Assyrian army had destroyed other civilization like Thebes, which in the fourth description Nahum will compare it to the destruction of Thebes. Every single part of the Assyrian culture, the Assyrian army, and the Assyrian wealth will be wiped from earth. That is complete destruction. And he picks up. We start in verse 3 with a third description of Nineveh's falls, which begins with a woe oracle. Nahum will continue to describe the destruction of Nineveh in absolute gruesome detail. So he starts off with, woe to the city of blood, full of liars, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of the whip, the clatter of the wheels, galloping horses, jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords, and glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over corpses. The first part of the third description describes why Nineveh is being destroyed, the circumstances of Nineveh. It says, woe to the city of blood, not describing what's happening as the city is being sieged and people are being killed, but rather describing the way in which Nineveh had gained its power through bloodshed. Full of lies, full of plunders, never without victim. Not only did Nineveh use their military hand to take over countries, but they also really used their military oppression to extort smaller nations into, bending at the knee to their power. So they are liars, they are full of plunders, never without victim. Not only never without victim, not only victim of death and destruction of the Ninevan army, but also the victims who lost their livelihood and their money and their trade and their lives due to the extortion of the city of Nineveh. He expands on those circumstances, picking up in verse 2. What Nahum will do is he's brought us from this 10,000-foot view of Nineveh's destruction. He's going to pull us into what does the street level look like. And he's going to this gruesome description of, if you could only imagine, I'm a huge fan of the Lord of the Rings movies. And when Helm's Deep, right? When, was it Rohan or whatever? When they retreat to Helm's Deep and the armies of Saruman break through, and you just see people dying in the streets, swords flashing by, spears, casualties everywhere. He's painting a picture of what the destruction of Nineveh will look like on the ground floor. And it's not pretty. This will come in the same way that they have destroyed others. See, Nineveh is a city of blood. I describe that, not describing the current state. I've already walked through that. God will not endure cities that are built on bloodshed. Micah 4, 1 through 4 clues us into that message. It's full of liars. Assyria controlled and lied for their own self-interest. And in Nineveh, Nineveh was not built, it was built on the back of victims through warfare, bloodshed, and extortion. Starting in verse 4, all of this because of the wanful lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nation by her prostitution and people by her witchcraft. Nineveh's prosperity, again, was brought about by oppression and injustice, but it was also very attractive to smaller nations. The idea of having an Assyrian major city as part of an alliance was very tempting to many smaller nations. And so what Assyria would do is they would tempt them in like a prostitute. They would make them promises as, yes, become our ally. You will experience riches and wealth. You can use our army. But in reality, they would lie to them, and they would essentially suck that nation dry for all they had, all their wealth, all their merchants, and then they would just leave them for dead. They were enslaved. These nations were enslaved by the Assyrians in that non-traditional way. See, these nations, they looked to the Assyria for their wealth and power, and soon fell into the seduction of Assyria and realized it only led to destruction. Here we go. Picking up in verse 5, I am against you. Oops. Yes. Picking up in verse 5, I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will lift your skirt over your face. I will show the nation your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. I will pelt you with filth and treat you with contempt. I will make a spectacle of you, and all those who see you flee will say, Nineveh is ruined. Who will mourn for her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? See, Nahum shifts tones in verses 5 through 7, again declaring that the Lord is against Nineveh and how he will humiliate and expose their nakedness, which in the ancient Near Eastern, nakedness represents both humility and vulnerability, as if you're naked, that's pretty humiliating, but also you have no protection of anything. You have no clothes even to protect you from the harmful rays of the sun. So let's walk through. Now, Nahum gives 5 consequences of the Lord being against Nineveh. The first was an analogy of Nineveh as a harlot. See, she seduced other nations, and now God promised to expose the nakedness to all the nations for what Nineveh really is. The second is a parallel consequence to the first. See, God would expose to the kingdom her shame. Her nakedness and shame are parallels, right, in this section. And Nineveh would be shamed in that. The third consequence intensifies Nineveh's public humiliation. Just as Nineveh had abused its own captives, exposing them to public ridicule, they too would be pelted with filth so that God would make them a spectacle of shame and that the other nations would never forget. International shame would be brought on Nineveh for everybody. Their reputation would be destroyed. When people think of Nineveh, the only thing they would think about is this, their destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, which came to pass. Think about it in the same ways of famous people who have had their reputations destroyed. Right? When I say Bobby Petrino, what image it conjures to mind? Is it him in the neck brace? Yeah. Exactly. Even though he's a great college coach, his reputation was destroyed in that one instance. The fourth consequence would see Nineveh being treated with contempt by God. God would treat Nineveh as a fool. And the final consequence would be destruction that would make Nineveh a spectacle. God would make Nineveh the same spectacle that the Assyrian king made of its captives. All right. We're just getting short on time, so let's jump to the final description. This one is fantastic. The final description of Nineveh's fall will compare the destruction of Nineveh to the destruction of Thebes. Okay? He picks up in verse 8, "Are you better than Thebes? Situated on the Nile, with water around her. The river was her defense, and the water was her walls. Cush and Egypt were her boundless strength. Put and Libya were among her allies." It's important to understand the context of Thebes. Thebes was a city that, exactly like Nineveh, had the same fortifications, the water of the Nile, had roughly the same in size of Nineveh. It had the same fortifications of strong and powerful allies, yet it fell to the Assyrian Empire in 663. And now, what Nahum is doing is saying, Thebes, like Thebes fell, so too Nineveh will fall. Yet she was taken into captive, went into exile. Her infants were dashed into pieces at every street corner. Lots were cast for her nobles, and all her great men were put in chains. In verse 10, Nahum describes 4 ways in which Thebes was treated by the Assyrian Empire that will come back around to destroy Nineveh. She was taken captive into exile. The people were sent into exile to become either sold into slavery to the surrounding nations or killed. The most gruesome second way in which Nineveh will be destroyed is that her infants were dashed to pieces at every street corner. So a common practice of the Assyrian army would be to take babies, grab them by their heels, swing them around, and bash them on the ground or bash them into the walls. And this was done at every street corner, which means it was done publicly and in view of probably the mothers. This is the gruesomeness in which the Assyrian Empire destroyed its nations. Thirdly, their nobles, their leaders, were cast for lots, meaning that this was a common practice that would determine who would become slaves and who would not. So even the ruler of Thebes would now become slaves to their attackers and the objects of gambling. And that nobles probably refers to middle management people who ran parts of the city but weren't the actual nobles themselves. But finally, it says, it addresses that. The great men were put in chains. See, the men who controlled the nations and decided the future of their citizens were now having their future decided as slaves and cast into exile. Again, these were common practices of the Assyrian army. It ensured that, by taking those who were there into exile to become slaves or to be killed, and killing of infants essentially ensured that the physical stature of the city of Thebes would be destroyed, the people would be destroyed, the leaders would be destroyed, and the next generation would be destroyed. This is a total destruction, a total wiping off of the city of Thebes by the Assyrian army. And the irony is that Nahum says the exact way in which you wiped off Thebes from the map, you're going to be wiped off the map too. So he says, you too will become drunk. You will go into hiding and seek refuge from the enemy. All your fortresses are like fig trees with their first ripe fruit. When they are shaken, the figs fall into the mouth of the eater. Look at your troops. They are weaklings. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies, and fire has consumed you at the gates. Nahum will use 5 imageries to help vivify the helplessness of the city of Nineveh, because the Babylonian army is coming to destroy you in the way that you destroyed Thebes. And when that happens, you will be like a staggering drunk. You will be like a panicked fugitive. You will be like a trembling fig tree, a feeble woman, and a city with its gates thrown open. Nahum is a master of metaphor. First, Nineveh was a lion deprived of its prey. Then it was a harlot who was shamed for their nakedness. And now in this taunting song of the end, they become drunk, weak, and dazed. And Nahum closes his book, verse 13 to 18. He says, look at your troops. They are all weaklings. The gates of your lands are wide open to your enemies, and fire has consumed the bars of your gates. Draw water for siege, strengthen your defenses, work the clay, tread the mortars, repair the brick. There the fire will consume you, and the sword will cut you down. They will devour you like a swarm of locusts, multiplying like grasshoppers, multiplying like locusts. You have increased the number of your merchants till they are more numerous than the stars in the skies, but they are like locusts that will strip away from the land. You guards are like locusts, your officials are swarms of locusts that settle on the walls on the cold day. But when the sun appears, they fly away, and nobody knows where. Closing his prophecy, Nahum will paint the hopelessness that Nineveh has when it comes to any defense. Nahum will encourage the Assyrians to prepare for attack even though they know the fire will destroy them. And throughout this series of imperative commands, Nahum issues a call of battle for preparations, and funny enough, he then immediately describes the depth of which their defeat will happen. The irony is of them being destroyed they will be destroyed like locusts. It's the same the way that Nineveh's people, mainly their merchants, made their living. They would swarm into other nations, consume them of their monetary value, and then leave, leaving them, destroyed. So Nahum continues the hopelessness of locusts in verse 17, comparing those to the people who were to defend the city. They too would flee like locusts. The soldiers, the officials, and all other defenders would be like locusts, flee quickly when it was time to go. Nobody knows where they went. And he closes it, verse 18 to 19, with an immediate address to the Assyrian king. He says, King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains, with no one to guard them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt the endlessness of your cruelty? In Nahum's final address, he draws a stark contrast to the God of the Assyrian Empire, who had no inclination himself or the inclination from those underneath him to gather those who were exiled from Nineveh during the siege, juxtaposed against the Lord of Lords from the house of Jacob, who will strive to ensure that all the lost sheep are found and his life is laid down for even one of them. Now there is no doubt in verse 19, Nahum emphasized that the fatal wounds of the kings of Assyria and his subjects. God had ensured Nineveh's destruction, and Judah's deliverance would be complete. See, in this context, and as we close out, we find that the true point of Nahum is that God is the Lord of history, who works in history to correct oppression and lift up the oppressed. When others stand against God for their ultimate supernatural evil and God defeats them, it signifies victory of God and the basis for hope that his power and justice will ultimately conquer evil. So, thank you for joining me today. That is the end of things. We ran over a little on time. But next week, we will pick up with the book of Habakkuk. So, thank you all.